There's been a suspicious attack in the Middle East on 2 oil tankers. The previous attack on the oil tankers were, of course, blamed on the Houthis, which is always associated with Iran. I wonder who this will be blamed on, but this gets more dubious and more dicey because there's a lot more going on with this story that we need to talk about. The Japanese Prime Minister goes to meet with Iranian ministers, Khomeini, in addition to the Jesus Christ, I can see his name with the beard. Meets with both of these guys. Goes meet with the leaders of Iran, Rouhani and Khomeini. So this is him meeting with Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini. While this was taking place, while this historic meeting was taking place, this happened. Let's talk about it on the soapbox. My name is Jamarl Thomas. This is indeed the Progressive Soapbox. And yeah, while this historic meeting was taking place, essentially, Prime Minister of Japan going all the way to Tehran to meet Ayatollah Khomeini. I may be pronouncing it slightly off, but I'm sorry. And the president, Rouhani. While both of these things were taking place, there was the suspicious attack on 2 Japanese tankers. Yes, these tankers just so happen to be Japanese in the Gulf of Oman. You talking about suspicious. I wasn't the only one that thought this was suspicious. Foreign Secretary in Iran goes out and naming it such. Reported attacks on Japanese-related tankers occurred while Prime Minister Abe was meeting with Ayatollah for extensive and friendly talks. Suspicious doesn't begin to describe what likely transpired this morning. Iran's proposed regional dialogue forum is imperative. Just so we know what took place. The Trump administration gets into office and pulled out the JCPOA. After pulling out the JCPOA, they ramp up sanctions, ramp up, you can say, rhetoric, going so far as to put American troops further into that region of the world, up in it by tens of thousands, with this notion of maximum pressure of squeezing Iran. Now, mind you, this was against the rest of the world. The rest of the world was literally against this. This was done unilaterally by the Trump administration. All of this being to try to get them to somehow come back to some level of talks. Why on earth would a country come back to talks with you after you unilaterally pulled out the agreement? Now, this gets more interesting. John Bolton gets put on the sideline to some degree, and Donald Trump says, call me. We can talk. Maybe. With this notion of, okay, this plan hasn't worked. The problem here is that the president is about to go through a presidential race, and he has put a lot of eggs in a basket of one Mr. John Bolton. And if you now, just before going into the presidential race, admit that this plan was an utter and complete failure, you will be hit with this relentlessly. The incentive here is not for the president to fire Bolton. The incentive here is not even for this open change of policy, even if internally there may be somewhat of a different change. Abe was also in the United States recently. This meeting, his point was to de-escalate, to bring down tensions. We need to bring these issues down. Even if you don't want to have a war, even if you're just trying to squeeze them, even if you're trying to make their life miserable so they can somehow negotiate and give up their country's sovereignty, even if that's what your intention is and you don't necessarily want to have a war. Doesn't matter. Those things can happen accidentally. This was a historic meeting. Japan, first meeting in like 40 years. And this suspicious doesn't begin to describe it. Of all the actors that are in this process, Saudi Arabia and Israel are willing to fight to the last dead American to get rid of Iran. I think that's true. I think most foreign policy experts will tell you the exact same thing. Of all the people that had something to gain in creating tension in this particular meeting, it is not Iran. I'm sorry, it is not Iran. I get Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, even elements within the context of the United States. John Bolton has wanted a war with Iran going back since John Bolton was an infant. I'm saying all of these people have a dog in this particular hunt. All of them. Each and every one of them. Do you know, at one point, we were talking about bombing a boat in order to blame it on Cuba. If you want to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin, there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We did talk about painting a plane with a U.S. label, so if Saddam shot it down, that we can blame Saddam getting a pretext to go into war. One war after the next. There was no, the start of the Spanish-American War didn't take place. It was all yellow journalism. In Turkey, Erdogan was caught on tape saying, look, we can take actions within the arena of Syria and we can just blame it on terrorists. Nobody would think otherwise. False flags happen. False flags are political reality. If the media is looking at you and they're reporting the story in a way that doesn't take into account the fact that governments act in ways in order to try to instigate or pull their countries into wars, then those media personalities are lying to you. They're lying to you. Fact of the matter is, governments have interests, and those governments' interests are often in the shadows. And sometimes there is a historical precedence of countries doing things in order to either pull their populations into war, often unbeknownst to those countries, and often justifying it under humanitarian grounds or grounds to which we have to, fight X or fight Y, or we're doing something for the best interests of A, or we're doing something for the best interests of B, or this is international interest, etc., etc., etc. All of these excuses, all of these lies, and oftentimes the media just runs with it. There's been a missile strike in Syria. Wait a minute, it's not in Bashar al-Assad's best interest to do that. We know foreign powers are looking to get involved into the war. So no, he's a bad guy. That's all that matters. He's a bad guy. I'm making a point to you that foreign policy, the way countries behave, the way countries act, they act in their own best interests. And at times, things like this happen, and they're quick to blame an actor that they don't particularly like, and often use that as a reason to go to fight, to drag their countries into conflicts. Donald Trump has instigated himself further and further, and regardless of whether he wants a foreign conflict or not, will, if anything happens, become irrelevant to the process. It just seems like between the bombing of the other ship that was in the port and this bombing, when these guys are meeting, that there are forces and there are elements out there that have a large budget that is against any notion of peace in that region of the world. Is Donald Trump serious about being open to talks without preconditions? We don't know. When Donald Trump says he wants to bring the troops home, and all of a sudden there's a missile strike or there's a chemical strike forcing the president's hand, and when the president at some point comes out and says, okay, I'm open to talks, and now all of a sudden you have attacks on these tankers and everything else. I don't know what's going on, but I would put to you that jumping to conclusions in the way that media is going to do is not the way to deal with it. And I would also put to you that the fact that you have various powers in this region that don't like Iran and that are looking to blame them and get the United States instigated into a conflict based on the conditions that the United States set in the beginning of this, that Donald Trump was stupid enough to put himself on the line for. Stay tuned. 2 Japanese tankers have been hit in the Gulf of Oman. Those tankers were hit, apparently, while this meeting was taking place. Or around the time, if I'm not mistaken, it was while this meeting was taking place. We don't know what's happening, but this is what it looked like. They were dead in the water. Expect your oil prices to go up. Expect your oil prices to go up. I'll keep an eye on this in regards to what's happening and what takes place, but be very clear, the United States is by itself in this. We unilaterally pulled out that agreement. Every other country around the world believes that that Iran is living up to that particular agreement. The United States was the country that pulled out and decided to not to live up to its agreements. And if any conflict pops off with this, we are on our own. We are completely in the wrong. Do not let the press convince you otherwise. We are the wrong party in this instance. This is not about freedom and justice or anything else. This is about power and domination of that region of the world. And just like other wars being started on bogus bogus pretext. Keep an eye out for this one. History doesn't repeat, but it damn sure rhymes. Missiles of mass destruction, Gulf of Tonkin, and now whatever's taking place in Oman. Stay tuned. Have a good one, guys.